In the spring of 1898, William James watched his country go to war and felt the ground shift under his feet. He had been a patriot in the way of thoughtful Americans of his generation, proud of the Republic's ideals, hopeful about democracy's future, and genuinely convinced that the United States represented something better than the old European powers with their empires and their endless wars. The Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines that followed it destroyed that conviction, and the destruction produced some of his most powerful writing. James joined the Anti-Imperialist League in 1898 and remained one of its most prominent members until his death. He wrote letters to newspapers, gave speeches, and argued with colleagues who supported the war. His opposition was not primarily strategic. He was not simply calculating that empire would be too expensive or too difficult. It was moral and psychological. The United States was doing something fundamentally wrong by conquering and subjugating a people who had been fighting for their own independence, and it was doing something psychologically corrupting to itself in the process. What disgusted James most was not the fact of violence. He understood violence as a permanent feature of human nature, but the rhetoric that accompanied it. The public discourse surrounding the Philippine War was saturated with the language of civilization, progress, and Christian duty. James saw this language for what it was, the self-flattering justification of conquest. He wrote that the slaughter of people who had done America no harm and only wanted to live their own lives was not civilization. It was savagery wearing the costume of civilization. His deepest analysis of war came later, in an address called The Moral Equivalent of War, delivered in 1906 and published in 1910, the year he died. The essay is one of the most psychologically honest treatments of human aggression ever written. James refused to begin with the assumption that war was simply the product of misunderstanding or bad leadership that could be eliminated by sufficient education and goodwill. He took seriously the appeal of war, the solidarity it produced, the intensity it generated, the sense of purpose and sacrifice it called forth. War, he acknowledged with uncomfortable honesty, spoke to something real and deep in human nature, the desire to be tested, to subordinate individual comfort to a cause larger than the self, to experience the full force of one's own capacities. The question, then, was not simply how to prevent war but how to satisfy the legitimate psychological needs that war fulfilled while redirecting the energies involved toward constructive, rather than destructive ends. James proposed what he called a moral equivalent of war, some form of organized, universal, non-military service that would impose hardship and demand genuine sacrifice for collective human benefit. Young people would serve not in armies but in the equivalent of armies, fighting not other human beings but poverty, disease, environmental degradation, and the accumulated suffering of the world. They would return from this service having been genuinely tested, having contributed genuinely, and having developed the sense of solidarity and purpose that war had previously been the only reliable means of producing. The proposal was prescient. The Civilian Conservation Corps, AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps all draw on the basic insight of the moral equivalent of war. The essay directly influenced Franklin Roosevelt and has been cited by every president who has promoted national service since. Whether any of these programs has fully achieved what James envisioned is debatable. What is not debatable is that he identified a real human need and a real structural problem with genuine precision. James's anti-imperialism was an extension of his deepest philosophical commitments. A man who believed that each individual consciousness was an irreplaceable center of experience, whose moral universe was built on the radical importance of each person's inner life, could not look at colonial conquest without recognizing it as a systematic violation of everything he thought philosophy should protect. His political activism was not a distraction from his philosophy. It was his philosophy in action. He understood that empire corrupts not just the colonized but the colonizers, that a society which teaches its young people to admire conquest is training them in a particular kind of soul. And he understood that this corruption could not be undone simply by good intentions or better rhetoric. It required a real alternative, a way of calling people to genuine hardship and genuine sacrifice in the service of something other than domination. That alternative was the great unfinished project of his final years. The moral equivalent of war was not a solved problem but a standing challenge, a demand that every generation ask itself what it is willing to be hard for, and whether its answer deserves the name of civilization. William James died in 1910, before he could see how prescient his warnings would prove. But his questions remain alive. What do we do with humanity's deep need for struggle and sacrifice? How do we build a society that calls people to something genuinely demanding without dressing up cruelty as heroism? Those are not just political questions. They are psychological ones. And they are still waiting for answers. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.